Hey everybody, welcome back from winter break. Welcome back to our Ed Puzzles. It's definitely been a minute, and so hopefully the review that we did at the start of class sort of helped contextualize things and bring you back to where we have been, of course, studying uh, ancient Rome. And um, when we last left off, we were talking about some of kind of the building of ancient Rome. How did ancient Rome become powerful? And we left off with the basically with the death of Julius Caesar. Um, and we're going to backtrack a little bit and talk now about some of the social and cultural aspects of ancient Rome. In other words, how did people live? How did the people of ancient Rome live? So the first thing that the book does for us is breaks down how men and women lived in ancient Rome. Um, Now, there's more to this, but a simple explanation would be that this society is what we would have called a patriarchy, where the men of ancient Rome had the power. Um, they made the decisions with government. They were the landowners. They were fighting in the army. Public life, and as a refresher, when I say public life, I mean basically anything that happens outside of your household or outside of your personal relationships. Public life um, was dominated by men. Now, that doesn't mean that every single man had power. As we'll get to in a bit, we'll see that some men lacked that power because of their social class, how much money they would have had. But uh, essentially, everybody who had an official position in Rome, an official position in government or in the military, were generally men. The center of Rome, of Roman life, was the family. When we say the family in ancient Rome, we would mean a man, a woman, and their children. Um, if you have heard the term nuclear family, where it's the family built around a father, and the father has most of the power, if not all of the power, and then below him would be the wife and children. That's what was going on in ancient Rome. It didn't mean that women couldn't do anything, but really the big decisions in families um, came down to the men, right? Uh, as our book says here, the head of the family, the father, he could even put family members on trial and punish them and even execute or kill them. So the man of the family has the power. So education was important in ancient Rome, but it wasn't as important as it was in Greece. Um, Poorer children, poorer boys would have worked as farmers. They would have worked in the field and done work to support the family. Some wealthier boys would have received an education that would have been similar to what we saw in ancient Greece, but but the majority of boys in ancient Rome were not educated. The ones that would become government workers, they would be educated, but other than that, education was just not as important in ancient Rome as it was in ancient Greece, rather. As far as women in ancient Rome goes, they didn't have official power. They couldn't vote. They couldn't be politicians. They could own property and manage their businesses, but even that was pretty rare. Typically, it was that would have been the husband. That said, women still were able to influence things sort of behind the scenes. The wives of Roman senators and Roman emperors, they could influence their husband's ideas and their husband's actions, and in that way, they could influence the government. If their husband was a businessman, the woman could kind of behind the scenes help with the business and with looking after the money and the finances. So they didn't have the rights that men had, but that doesn't mean that they didn't have some impact on society. They definitely did. That being said, the main role for a woman in ancient Rome was to be a good wife and a good mother. So it would, be loyal to your family. Uh, you'd be doing chores around the house and looking after the children. Um, but for the most part, with a few exceptions, this was kind of the limit of what women could do, especially in poorer houses. Where where even the men don't have as much power in society. In those poorer houses, women are really uh, looking after the house and the children. In some of the wealthier families, they might be able to have some influence, but again, that's a very small amount of women in ancient Rome. Um, as far as their education goes, if you were wealthy, you might, as a girl, learn how to read and write and do math, but even then, not very common. Most people in Rome weren't wealthy enough to let their daughters learn to read and write because, excuse me, in order to make the household work and in order to make things run smoothly around the house, their idea was that the young girls needed to first learn how to run a household and help the mother out, and that would in turn make them good wives when they got married, as our book says here, sometimes as young as 12 years old. And as we mentioned uh, in our slideshow, uh, marriage back then, to say that it never had to do with love, that wouldn't be correct because there certainly were some marriages that had to do with love. But oftentimes, marriage was more about, money. Like you wanted to marry somebody who would be able to support you and put bread on the table and feed you and look after you, basically, and create this ideal Roman family. Um, if you were wealthy, then especially marriage would have less to do with love and more to do with power. If we want to tie in, there are a ton of movies and TV shows where this idea is looked at. Like if anyone is a fan of Game of Thrones, you kind of see how the marriages aren't really about love. They're more about one powerful family marrying into another powerful family, and then they can work together to gain more power and more money. So, again, that would be more in the wealthier families. So, speaking of wealth, there were, like in ancient Greece, a similar class structure. And when we say class structure, we're talking about levels of money and power. In Rome, at the top, you would have had your aristocracy, which is that word over here that's highlighted in yellow. The aristocracy were basically rich people who owned land and who were politicians. That was a really small group, but it was the most powerful group. Below then, below them, you have what would be called the plebeians. The plebeians were kind of like your middle class. They were farmers and businessmen, and different kind of workers, artisans. People that make stuff and sell it. And a lot of them were very poor. Some of them were wealthier, or maybe what we would call like upper middle class. But a lot of these people who didn't have a lot of power were pretty poor. And then below the plebeians were the slaves. And just like in ancient Greece, the majority of people in ancient Rome at this time were slaves. And they were brought in to farm and they were brought in to build things. They would, you might have a household slave that does chores around the house. They might make things that your family would then sell. But they could also even be teachers and doctors or like kind of assistants to their masters' businesses. So slaves had a lot of different roles in society. Um, to circle back to the rich and the poor, so the wealthy families lived in houses like these, and we can expand. So, like right here, you would have the entrance hall, where the wealthy people, they would have like supporters and what were called patrons, people that come to visit and kind of ask for favors or do work, do jobs for the family, for the wealthy family. Here we have the reception room, which is where you would like show off how much money you have, and you would meet your visitors there. Um, and we see there's this like rectangular space up here that kind of dips downward. That was like their gutter, kind of like it collected rainwater. So you see some of the Roman innovations. Like some homes today, they had kind of a home office where they would do their business, and then in the back here they would have this courtyard, which is like a garden, like a private garden for them to relax and read or socialize, stuff like that. Poor people mostly lived in uh, on farms or in really like overcrowded buildings, and uh, kind of a stereotypical view of poverty, just overcrowded. They would eat much simpler foods. They would get forced off of their land by the wealthy and the rich, and all of this led to them revolting sometimes, or uh, rebelling, looking for more rights. Right? They're the biggest group of people in Rome, but they had the fewest rights, as our book says. They were property that could be bought and sold. They had a number of different jobs. And even though some of these slaves were treated well, um, we'll get eventually to the story of Pompeii, which you may have heard about. It was a town that was situated right next to a volcano, Mount Vesuvius. And when the volcano erupted, it wiped out the entire town. But the ashes from the volcano preserved the people. And so if you go to Pompeii today, the people are kind of frozen in time. Um, let's see if we can get a good picture of Pompeii. Uh, you'll see what I mean here, right? Like we see here, these were people who lived a couple thousand years ago, who died in this volcano, and their bodies were preserved. Well, the point of me bringing that up is there are people who were wealthier, and we know they were wealthy because they were found like in their courtyards and in their fancy estates like this one, but they were found like lying, either holding their slaves or maybe holding a slave's hand. uh, and it shows us how close sometimes masters and slaves were. So they were not all treated poorly. Others were treated very poorly, and it would lead to the occasional rebellion where the slaves would rise up and try to take power for themselves or get some rights and power back. But those were usually put down pretty quickly and resulted in a lot of people dying. Um, the most famous example would have been Spartacus, which you may have heard the name Spartacus. He was a slave who led this famous rebellion against the Roman soldiers. And there's a movie called Spartacus, that's pretty famous. Uh, but again, that rebellion was put down. And as we see here, when he was finally defeated, 6,000 of his followers were killed as a warning to other slaves. And then we have the gods and beliefs of the Romans. So to sort of simplify this and make it not get into as much detail, there are a few takeaways. One, the Roman gods, their ideas of the gods took a lot and borrowed a lot from the Greek gods. Um, the stories, the character traits, all of that, even how some of them looked, they were borrowed a lot from the Greek gods. Uh, what was different was the Roman gods had human traits. Like here's Neptune, the god of the sea. He looks like just a Roman, just what a Roman, like maybe a general might have looked like. So this is a Greek god, and the gods of, or excuse me, a Roman god. The gods of ancient Rome, uh, they kind of each had something that they were in charge of on Earth. So if we zoom here, we see Jupiter was the king of the gods. Juno was the goddess of women, marriage, childbirth, and children. Mars was the god of war. Venus was the god of love, goddess of love. So if you were going to war, you might pray to Mars to give you it to lead you on a successful campaign. If you wanted like someone to fall in love with you, or you wanted your marriage to be blessed, you would pray to Venus. Um, those were what are called the Pantheon, which are like the key group of Roman gods. Romans also had household gods, which were gods that they would have like a statue or a figurine. Every Roman house would have had this, a statue or figurine of a god that you would keep in your house or take with you when you travel or when you go to battle. And they believed that that household god would protect you and your family. And so you prayed to that god. And again, every house would have had that. And as far as beliefs go, the Romans were their kind of most important character trait was called gravitas. Okay, and gravitas it 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 doesn't have a direct translation into English, but it basically means having this like seriousness about you and this motivation, um, and determination that you would use to achieve greatness for yourself, for your family, and for the Roman Empire. So gravitas was like the most important thing. The gods were around to remind you of the importance of gravitas, um, and that was sort of the one thing that in ancient Rome everyone revolved around. You had to be a great Roman, you had to have this gravitas, which again is like being serious, hardworking, um, ambitious, which would mean like you want to have a lot of success. And so that's gravitas. Okay. So that is going to do it for this little section on kind of what the Romans lived like and what they believed. As always, feel free to ask me questions, pause your video, rewatch it, whatever you got to do. All right.